Good. Well, there we are. I think we're just about ready. And good morning to you all. After the fun of pop art yesterday, something a bit more sobering. Many of you, I suspect, have at least a passing acquaintance with Anselm Kiefer, a German artist deeply concerned with collective memory. He was born in 1945, just as the Second World War was coming to an end and the full horrors of the Nazi death camps were coming to light. Death camps in which millions of Jews, but also gypsies, homosexuals, political dissidents, were deprived of their dignity as well as their possessions and exterminated. How could this have happened? The question was asked over and over again. The country that had produced Bach, Beethoven, Goethe, how could it have sunk into such an abyss? The question was met always with silence. Germany was in ruins. The people, dazed, were trying to pick up the pieces of their lives. Hitler was dead, the promise of a 1,000-year Reich with him. How could all this have happened? At the time, Kiefer, born in 1945, was now a student reading law at university, but feeling disillusioned with the subject. And he was wrestling with himself as a young, born free, if you like, perhaps the first of the born frees. Looking back at this era, how could this have happened? Law didn't seem to satisfy him. So he dropped out of university and went to France, to Lyon, where there was a monastery called La Tourette, which had been designed by Le Corbusier, which had received a lot of attention for its artistic skill. He went to La Tourette, and here it is. And he was immediately struck by the spirituality of the place, created out of soaring but very simple means. Instead of staying just for the day, he stayed 3 weeks living with the monks, his ideas slowly filtering through his head as to how he wanted to spend his life. Burning inside him, of course, was this question of how could it have happened. And he decided that it was probably going to be through art that he would try to come to grips with this conundrum. In order to get inside the psyche of the people who had perpetrated these terrible things, he thought he would have to put himself in their place. At home, he found his father's military uniform, which he put on, and then, with a companion, traveled around Europe to some of the sites of the German occupation. And there, dressed in his uniform, he has himself photographed on the left there, standing on a building in Paris, giving a Nazi salute, caught between gnarled boughs of a tree. And on the right there, he does the same, standing on the seashore, mindful of Caspar David Friedrich's famous painting here, looking out the wanderer above the sea of the fog. What an appropriate title. A romantic image from the 19th century. And there, Kiefer imitates that to answer that question, the fog. During the summer, he said, in autumn of 1969, I occupied Switzerland, not quite sure why Switzerland, but there we are, France and Italy. I had to reenact what they did in order to understand the madness. And when he got back, he did some watercolors. Here, in a Goering-type greatcoat, he stands in a pristine field of snow, now stained with evil, giving a Nazi salute. He was told, stop wallowing in the past, we've got to move on. Others accused him of being a Nazi sympathizer. But he knew that he had a new path to tread to try to understand what had happened. And he became, slowly and progressively, the conscience of this new generation. Delving into German mythology to try to get to the roots of the German psyche, forests loom large. And here he depicts himself in a white gown holding a flaming branch in a clearing, the better to understand German history, culture, and psychology. It's not only the forests and the trees that seem to be so ingrained in German psyche, it's the very wood itself which has such resonance. Here he paints an old deserted schoolroom which he acquired as his studio, and in it he lovingly paints every knot and whirl of the grain of every beam and board. The center is unoccupied except for Odin's sword, which in the myth he plunged into a tree, but here it's plunged into the floor but stained with blood. And now that schoolhouse studio has expanded to form the great hall of Odin, in which the souls of the dead are interred. Torches are lit on either side in memory of Germany's cultural heroes. But the torches are rather close to the wood, and the inevitable will happen. It will all go up in a great conflagration, like in the climactic last act of Wagner's Götterdämmerung. He now paints something that's more close to his own memory. The scorched earth, smoke still rising, flames, a village in the background still on fire, and right in the distance, difficult to see, you may not be able to make it out, but is written in German in a sort of cursive script, right at the top of the left of the screen there, the words, "Father is in the war, mother is in Pomerania, Pomerania is burning." That was a nursery rhyme he learnt at his mother's knee. He now goes back further to the origins of German nationhood, which can be placed at 9 AD, in which the German chieftain Hermann defeated the Roman general Quintinius Varus. And here is a forest, again, so important. This battle took place in the Teutoburg forest. And here, Kiefer tries to come to grips with the origins of German nationhood with this painting he calls just Varus. Varus is linked to the various names you can see written there, which are the subsequent German heroes. So you can see where he's coming from. He's trying to get right to the roots of German psyche to understand how this aberration could have occurred. And now he puts faces to the names. There they are, the faces of the heroes, Beethoven, Bach, and Goethe, and Schiller, and etc. But in the middle of the forest now is a fire, soon to engulf everything in flame. When he learnt of the Nazi rampage of book burning that had taken place shortly after they had come to power, this hurt Kiefer to his very core. For after all, what are books? They're the repositories of mankind's deeds, their ideas, and their ideals. His reaction to the book burning was profound and occupied him for over a decade. He made books himself to make atonement for what had happened. Here, out of dewlap, he's made a book, but he's covered the open pages with ash to commemorate the burning, but as a form of self-emulation almost, he made the ash out of some of his early paintings which he burned. He then makes a series of books, hundreds of books, can you believe, out of lead, beating the panels thin enough to form the pages. Why lead? For the ancient alchemists, lead had two prime qualities. It's a purifier, and it can transform into other things. So lead symbolically can purify and transform a nation. And he intersperses it with straw. You can see there some dried out twigs and things, which of course becomes a universal fertilizer to help the process of transformation along. He builds a library out of 200 lead books. Can you imagine making 200 lead books? And in that library, on the left-hand side there, on the top shelf, you can see in the middle there, a panel in which he's put the word Euphrates. And on the right-hand side, another panel in which he's put the word Tigris, recalling the lost libraries of antiquity. again scattering straw to fertilize this transformation, to bring the libraries back to life. And here he's assembled some books in a bookcase, but the books have been smashed, they've torn, they've been burned, and interspersed among them is glass, fragments of glass, to commemorate that fateful night in November 1938, Kristallnacht, when the Nazis went on a rampage, burning synagogues and smashing the storefronts of Jewish-owned property. Kristallnacht was but the herald of the Holocaust. And Kiefer was very much drawn to the poem by the Romanian-French poet Paul Celan, Death Fugue. Harrowing stuff, I have to caution you. The poem begins by telling of what the inmates had to sustain them for their short lives. Black milk at dawn, we drink you. At midday we drink you. At night we drink you, we drink you. And then the poem goes on to talk about their guard, who in the evening goes back to his hut and is writing to his sweetheart. He writes, Celan tells us, a man lives at home. He writes in the German-born nightfall of the gold of your hair, Margarita. He goes on, he steps outside. The stars are a-glitter. He whistles his hounds, he whistles his Jews, and has them spade out a grave in the ground. We spade a grave in the air, so it won't feel so tight. He then orders them, play up for a dance, play sweeter, he yells, scrape the strings darker, for you'll rise through the air like smoke. And they do. The poem goes on to talk about not only Margarita, the golden-haired prototype, I suppose, of German womanhood, her feet implanted in the German soil, but also of the dark-haired Shulamit with her companions. And after reading that poem, which still affects me now as I reread it, as I'm sure it does you, he produces this work. We see the golden-haired Margarita, sheaths of straw, can you see? And behind, the ash rising as Shulamit and her companions are put in the ovens. Powerful stuff. He now has to reconcile what had happened with the past to build a new Germany, a new psyche. And he does so by taking one of his lead books and placing it out just in the open air. And he leaves it there for months at a time just to see what happens. And of course it weathers in a certain way. And here he sees in the weathering, as he goes to it a couple of months later, he sees black areas which reminds him of Shulamit. Areas that appear to be golden in color reminds him of Margarita. And so he adds locks of hair. Can you see of the top right-hand page there? And here we have Shulamit being embraced by Margarita. Here is one of the memorial halls that are renowned in German mythology. And at the end, he has a menorah, burning flame in memory of Shulamit. The sky, the roof of the hall blackened by fire. And now he turns to Berlin, 1945. Here we see Albert Speer's great hall for Hitler's chancellery, now blackened with the destruction of the Soviet occupation of the city. But on the ground in the middle there, we can see he's placed some straw. And streaming through the skylight, the sunlight has ignited the straw in order that the flames will destroy the old, the ash will fertilize the new. And here in a soft, gentle watercolor, he memorializes the artists who were deemed degenerate, a reflecting pool in the center of which is an artist's palette, commemorating those artists who were driven into exile, who were in despair, and even committed suicide. Certain works depict the Old Testament. And the formation of the State of Israel in 1948 for Kiefer was somehow a redemptive act for him. And here he depicts in this collage a photograph of the Sinai desert, and above a leaden cloud with a finger of God pointing down, guiding the Israelites on their exodus from Egypt to the Promised Land. In 1983, he paid his first visit to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, its history of 3,000 or more years, layer upon layer of history, of triumphs, of two temples built and destroyed, of occupations, where every human emotion over the decades and centuries and millennia had played out. How do you capture Jerusalem in a painting? Well, this is Kiefer's attempt. Layer upon layer, paint, gold leaf, black lead, silver paint, applied further, layer upon layer upon layer, recapturing the essence of the city. And if we look closely at one portion of this, we can see he's added a strip of iron. Can you see going off diagonally there on the left-hand side? And he's made it into the form, can you believe, of a ski. Well, they do get snow in Jerusalem, but it's not very often, and you certainly can't do any skiing. Why did he put a ski there? He didn't say, but to my mind, it's as if the present-day population of Jerusalem is just skimming over the surface of what lies below. He was invited in 1990 back to Jerusalem to receive a prize from a foundation for furthering the understandings between people. And as a gift to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, he brought this aeroplane, a passenger jet, stylized of course, but noticed that the wings are laden with books, which summarizes, I think, the paradox of modern Israel. Now he goes back to the forest. But now we can't enter the forest because its entry is covered by brambles and briars. And if you can see there at the bottom, a shed snakeskin and scattered human teeth. We can't enter now because this is hallowed ground. It's the site where tens of thousands were massacred. It all started with an exclusion. Juden sind in unserer deutschen Wäldern nicht erwünscht. Jews not welcome in our German woods. The exclusion culminated in the cattle cars and a one-way journey to Auschwitz. And in a final catharsis for Kiefer, he paints this, a desolate field with a railway line. And as we follow the railway line, we can see it divides. One track goes to the left, one track goes to the right. He leaves it to us to decide which track to take. Collective memory, then. Let's relax and cheer ourselves up. Difficult stuff. Collective memory, then, is the essence of Kiefer, and you can see where he's coming from, and the universality of his message. We turn now to Louise Bourgeois, French-American sculptor, who was unrecognized until she was 71 years old, in spite of doing magnificent work, which we're going to see, over 40 years. And in 1971, she was given a one-artist show in New York City to great critical acclaim, at an age when the other galleries in New York were exhibiting works by artists young enough to be her grandchildren. She was concerned with personal memory, but personal memory that had universal resonance, and that's the key. She's best known for her giant spiders, mother figures, which I'm sure you are familiar with, which now adorn the forecourt of museums around the world. Giant figures, 40, 50 feet tall, mother figures. And it was her relationship to her mother, but particularly her father, and other memories of childhood, that have haunted her and are the subject of almost her entire body of work, but again, that have universal resonance. These memories, she said, are very important to me. They appear and all of a sudden disappear. I want to be in control of the past and give them permanence. She was born at the beginning of the 20th century into a family of tapestry restorers. They restored 17th and 18th century tapestries. They had a showroom on the left bank in Boulevard Saint-Germain in Paris, where Louise grew up. Her father was a serial philanderer, so much so that under the same roof he was sleeping with Louise's governess, Sadie. Her mother was an intelligent and forgiving woman who regarded her duty to keep the family together. But for the young Louise, awareness of what had happened was to her a betrayal she could never get over. The actual tapestry restorations were carried out in this 18th century villa in a little town just outside Paris. And there it is, and there's the young Louise. And as she was a little bit older than this photograph, she would be employed, really to keep her out of mischief, to do designs where the patches, the threads of the tapestry had worn, a new image had to be put in by the weavers there. They employed some 30 weavers to restore the tapestries. And she would do drawings that she thought were appropriate to fit in. Whether they were actually used or not, we don't know. But she would then go home at the end of the day, back to the apartment in Paris, and for nights at a time, father would not appear. He would be on one of his dalliances. And she very movingly writes that sometimes at home, when father did not appear, I would curl up in a big armchair, and for days at a time I would sit there, getting smaller and smaller, shriveling like a pea. Shows how her mind works. And then years later, she does this sculpture, a scale model in marble of the factory where the restorations were made. Above it, a guillotine blade, manipulated by the handle and the rope there on the right-hand side. And then you can ceremoniously go up to this, pull the handle, and the guillotine blade comes down, amputating those painful memories. She was a good student at school, went on after lycée to the Sorbonne, where she read mathematics, can you believe? Very bright girl. And there, whilst doing her mathematics course, she also took evening classes in a private art academy because she was very interested in art and very creative and thought about being an artist perhaps long term rather than a mathematician. She also got a job as a part-time docent at the Louvre, which I thought was quite an achievement. And there she met a visiting art historian from New York who was on the up and up, Robert Goldwater. The two of them hit it off, and before long they were married. Robert went back to New York, and a few months later in 1938, she went to join him in New York. A new life. But there was conflict. A budding artist, but now she had obligations to her husband. He was a rising academician in the art world, and there were social events that she had to prepare, be a hostess for him, as well as other household duties. And here she gets out of her system as best she can her feelings at that time. In this work here, 3 paintings that she's done side by side, quite tall, which she calls Femme Maison, woman house, a play on the word housewife. The first 2 pictures don't require any explanation, of course. The conflict between womanhood, her social duties, and the housebound necessities. But on the right now, it's almost like a catharsis. She has to get it out of her system. The colours have darkened, and we can see these waving arms, let me out of here, let me out of here. But it was the birth of her son, Jean-Louis, which suddenly smoothed her out, and she became calmer. And here she does a sculpture, and this is Jean-Louis, her firstborn son. And there he is with his feet like roots tapping down into the soil of America. And there is her vision for him, soaring like a skyscraper. And then she does some sculptures related, I think, to her sexuality. Here, in a sculpture which I think we would say would be a semi-abstract human form, female form, I think you can see there. But interestingly, she calls this femme couteau, wife-knife, a play between knife and wife, implying, well, I could leave it to you to surmise what it implies. And then, with the skill of a Renaissance sculptor, she carves this, can you believe, carves this out of a single block of marble. A torso comprising breasts, probably, she doesn't say, but certainly one eye, can you see, with a big pupil and an eyelash there, and most significantly, the rough, unformed head, clearly wrestling with how she's going to intellectualize and rationalize her burgeoning sexuality. But it was this relationship with her father, that unending sense of betrayal, that produced this harrowing work on a gigantic scale, like a cave. A sculpture in which, in the center, we can see a table looking like an altar with offerings. And above these hemispherical structures in rows, above and below, bathed in red light, to my mind, like chomping teeth. And she recalls, related to this sculpture, when asked about it because it's so enigmatic, she recalls sitting at the dining room table with her two sisters while her father ranted on about all his boasting achievements. And the girls between them conspired to pull their father's limb from limb and to gobble him up. As far as her mother was concerned, her mother was an industrious spider, protecting the home and working away in the tapestry factory with threads of silk. Mother could also be threatening, the same way that spiders can. But at heart, she was always a mother, and there a clutch of eggs in the abdomen of one of these giant spiders in the museum forecourts that we saw earlier. Eggs that would become her children, over whom she would stand protective guard. And there you can just see the scale of this thing. I need my memories. They are my documents. And now she turns to something completely different in order to convey her memories. Large structures that she called cells. These are installations, they're life-size. We're permitted to gaze into them, but we cannot enter them. But to help us identify ourselves with the object that she's put inside there, she installs mirrors. Can you see one at the top in the roof there? And this swinging mirror at the entrance. It's to involve us with her life, hoping that something in her life and her past will resonate with us in our life. And in the center there, we can see on a stand a block of marble. And here, she has carved exquisitely an adult hand clasping in comfort the nervously gripped hands of a child. Who can't relate to that? And here she has done another cell on the left side. These are just two views of it. On the left side there, we are permitted to look inside through an entranceway. Can you see the doorway there empty? And on the right, we can get a closer view as to what actually is inside. It's like a wooden cylinder, as you can see. And inside is a hard iron bedstead. And on either side of the bedstead are these poles with glass flasks of different sizes and shapes. Out of sight, not captured in this photograph, is a hook on the wall with a hanger on which she has suspended a girl's dress. And over the shoulders of the dress, she has placed a man's jacket. She calls this work precious liquids. And she doesn't tell us what those liquids are. It's for us to surmise. Are they tears? Are they beads of sweat from anxiety? Or are they perhaps related to the sexual awakening of a young woman? And here she does side-by-side cells, which she calls red rooms. On the left, the child's room. And we can see it's broken. There's a crack in it, and it's got the sort of chicken wire running through the glass. So it's a view that you have to really try to work your way around through the obstacles to see. And what do we see inside? We see red spindles, reminding us of the skeins of silk and wool that were in the tapestry factory. But there, they would have been all the colours of the rainbow. But here they're red. Why red? The colour of passion, colour of anger, the colour of shame. She contrasts that with the neighbouring red room, which is her parents' room. Cold, a hard bed, on which is an empty violin case and a toy train. Suspended above the bed looks like a soft balloon full of red liquid, perhaps about to burst and cascade its contents. Complex, but you can see the push and pull of her childhood memories and of her own room and her parents' room. And then at the age, can you believe, of 86, she now produces this 30-foot long installation, which really consists of 3 cells in 1 cell. And can you see on the right side there, from the ceiling, she's suspended chairs, exactly like her father used to do, putting up the chairs on hooks onto the ceiling of the factory whilst waiting for their backs and seats to have their tapestries restored. But unlike the other cells, these are rather sparsely furnished, and this is the 1 cell she allows us to enter and walk through. And as we do so, here we are, we can see the chairs in the distance there. The cells are very sparsely furnished. A few dusty, faded memorabilia from her own childhood. And now she invites us to fill the empty space with objects from our own childhood memories. And that is Louise Bourgeois. It isn't personal. It is personal, but it doesn't stop there. She invites us to share her memories in order that we can relive some of our own. Quite different from Tracey Emin, the English artist. The murmur tells me you've heard of her. I feel so much better, thank you. Controversial artist, to be sure. She does her own version of a Louise Bourgeois cell, but it's a tent. And in this tent, she calls it Everybody I Have Ever Slept With. And what she means by that is that as we go, she invites us inside, and we go inside the tent, and there we can see the names of 100 people she's ever slept with. Lovers, to be sure, but also family members and friends, and rather ghoulishly, the names that she had given to 2 fetuses she aborted. To my mind, this is not embracing the Louise Bourgeois memory that we share with her, but this to me is voyeurism. And it's a personal critique, but I leave it to you to decide on that. What it does is allows us to see a window into her life, the chaotic life that she had of failed relationships, of alcohol, of depression, and abuse. Valid, to be sure, but I just question whether this does anything more than just represent a personal confession, a catharsis for her, but somehow leaves me personally aside. I'm not involved, but I leave it up to you, and perhaps I'm being unfair. It was her next work that caused the greatest controversy of all, both in the public, because that work had put her on the map big time, as you can imagine, or greatly, as somebody would have said. Bigly, no, that's the word, isn't it? Bigly. Her next work caused a major controversy. So much so that art students dressed themselves as clowns to picket the entrance of the Tate Britain Museum on Millbank in London, just by the Thames, which I'm sure many of you know. And they picketed this exhibition. Why? Well, what they did, they dressed as clowns because they had awarded the director of the Tate, Sir Nicholas Sirota, a highly respected art historian of 30 years' tenure. They had awarded him Art Clown of the Year award. Why? Because he had selected, together with the committee of the Turner Prize, Britain's most prestigious prize for contemporary art, to Tracey Emin. She had not been awarded the prize, but she was elected a finalist for the prize for this work. Tracey's original, genuine, unmade bed, in which she had slept, made love, menstruated, eaten pizza, and on the floor, discarded there on the carpet, you can see there, discarded food packages, a packet of cigarettes, some cigarette butts, pair of slippers there, a toy animal, plush toy, some condoms, various other bits and pieces. This was the artwork, finalist for the Turner Prize. Well, an original, absolutely, and give her credit for that. But is it art? And we come back to the dilemma yesterday, and your definition of art is as valid as mine, but you still have to ask the question, is it art? Well, somebody thought so, because she was elected a Royal Academician, and not only that, subsequently appointed Professor of Drawing. I don't think she'd ever drawn anything in her life, but Professor of Drawing at the Royal Academy of Art in London. And then in 2013, she is driven to Buckingham Palace to receive from none other than Her Majesty the Queen the insignia and instruments of a commander of the British Empire. Well, there you are. It pays to be original, that's for sure. And now we turn to somebody who I think is the link man between collective memory of Anselm Kiefer and the private but shared memories of Louise Bourgeois. And that, of course, is South Africa's own William Kentridge. William Kentridge devotes his work to exploring the paradoxes of living in South Africa during the apartheid years, and subsequently, I'm sure, in which he says, a country in which memory competes with amnesia. He was born into a family of distinguished civil rights lawyers, as I'm sure you knew, the family coming from Lithuania and settling here in the 1880s. And he's lived all his life just about in Johannesburg, and almost all his work reflects that area. I work, he says, in a narrow gap between optimism, held in check, and pessimism, held at bay. A narrow gap indeed. What he does is not, his work is not a personal catharsis, as it was for Anselm Kiefer, coming to grips with his nationhood and where he stood in it, nor the personal catharsis of Louise Bourgeois, coming to grips with the demons of her own childhood, which he wants to share with us. Rather, it's a continuous interrogation about his experiences that he shares with all South Africans. An interrogation in which he offers no answers. And that's the essence of Kentridge, I think, to put us there to solve the problems for ourselves. He started his creative work really with concern about the way the natural countryside was being despoiled by development. And here he's meticulously copied in his signature charcoal an illustration from a 19th century travel book, Africa and Its Peoples. And this wonderful pristine scene here he portrays and superimposes on it surveyor's marks indicating that somebody's got their beady eye on this site for the development perhaps of a resort hotel or something of the like. And now he turns his attention to the pristine Highveld, now despoiled by mine dumps as he sees it, the terrain becoming a wasteland, the mine dumps incongruously having the screens of a built-in cinema, the hills in the distance now being overtaken. A pristine stream has now become a culvert for industrial waste. But his genius was in his animated films. I'm sure some of you at least have seen these. And these are a unique contribution to 20th century art. Essentially, it's stop-action photography. You've seen cartoons that are stop-action, little jerky things. But his genius there is to actually have the image morph, change its form on shots so one thing becomes something else, and thus the story is told. Here we see him at work. Can you see on the left-hand side there, he's working on the same picture we just saw there, the high felt despoiled by the mine dumps. So what he does, he puts his drawing up, and then with his movie camera, he shoots just a couple of frames. Boom, 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 boom. Stops. Goes back to the picture, rubs something out, and then draws something else in his charcoal in its place. Couple more shots. Boom, boom, boom. Does the same again. And little by little, over a course of 8 or 10 minute film, it's like watching one of those early silent movies, you know, jerky sort of things, lights flashing where the emulsions come off the celluloid and that sort of thing. It has that sort of effect, which is utterly mesmerizing. But it's the subject matter, of course, which is so unique. So it engages us. We have this sort of ancient memory of having seen, if not in reality, at least subsequently, these old silent flickering movies. It has that emotive effect on us, but the content is what matters, of course. It's very much akin. He called this way of making movies, he called it Stone Age movie making in his modest way. But what he was doing really was standing on the shoulders. Nothing is new in the world. We've all discovered that. Every great invention is in fact an adjustment to something that went before. And here what he's done, he's brought up to date Honoré Daumier's cartoons of the unpopular French monarch Louis Philippe. There he is on the left, scowling at us with his curly wig, and now he's slowly morphing into a pear. And this is what, you can visualize this now as a movie, and you can actually see the morphological changes occurring before your eyes, and this is his genius. And he now introduces us in the first of these films, which he called Johannesburg, second greatest city after Paris. Well, I think it's lovely, isn't it? He introduces us to two of his alter egos. The first is Soho Eckstein, always seen wearing a dark suit, which Kentridge tells him reminded him of his own grandfather, who day in, day out always wore the same dark suit. Soho Eckstein is an avaricious, unremitting industrialist and property developer. And there he is now sitting down to a gargantuan breakfast. And slowly, slowly, slowly on the left there, you can see the breakfast table. As his mind is working, he can see there's some land waiting for development. And you can see, I've omitted the 20 or 30 frames that would link one to the other, but you get the idea. And on the other side, we have another one of Kentridge's alter egos, Felix Teitelbaum. Felix is an idealist, a poetic dreamer, always depicted naked. And here is Felix looking out over the city, which is now simply car land, cars zooming everywhere, one highway, cars going, cars coming, some going over an overpass, some an underpass. And below, slowly, we see those cars morphing into the people who were displaced in order that the roads and the bridges and tunnels could be built. And now he depicts in a short film called Mine. And there are the miners sleeping in his imagined sleeping quarters. It almost looks like amputated heads, doesn't it? They're all lined up. But that image then morphs into this historical document, the deck, below decks, the sleeping accommodation of slaves on the Middle Passage between Africa and the Caribbean. And now we have another short film called Monument. And here's Soho Eckstein, microphones and everything, announcing the opening, the unveiling of a monument. And the monument, of course, is to Soho Eckstein. There's the monument, the cord's about to be unwrapped, and we see the monument itself. And the film then zooms in at the bottom of the monument, and we can see that it is supported on the backs of his workers. But now, in his greatest stop animation film, which he calls History of the Main Complaint. And as a physician, that relates to me because all medical students are taught that when you first see a patient, you must document why they've come to see you. And that is called the main complaint, and then you ask questions around it. So he's called this film History of the Main Complaint. And in it, he introduces some complex psychological ideas, because in it, we see Soho Eckstein now a patient in which he now has to think back to the deeds of his past. There he is, you can't see him because he's crowded out by these doctors, all of them, interestingly, wearing identical Soho Eckstein suits, which means nobody's exempt from this critique. We then move in the film to several views where we see Soho Eckstein driving around the country roads around Johannesburg, and then the camera zooms in at the rearview mirror. And instead of seeing Soho Eckstein's penetrating, uncompromising gaze, we see the soft, inquiring gaze of Felix Teitelbaum as he recalls a painful incident that happened. What that incident was there was Soho driving along, and on the left-hand side of the road, you can see on the top left-hand side of the screen there, you can see the eyes, but just look, just where the road begins to bend round to the left there, on the left-hand side of that white line, you can see something a bit blurred. And what we see is somebody lying on the ground being kicked and punched by two others. Soho drove on. As he was driving past, a figure suddenly darts across the road from the right-hand side, dashes across to help the poor victim who's being assaulted, and in doing so is struck by Soho's car. He's flung against the windshield and then falls back onto the road and is killed. Soho drives on. We're now back in the hospital, and Soho is x-rayed. And they do the x-ray, and my goodness me, there is his typewriter. The typewriter in which he composed all his excuses for his past deeds and misdeeds. Soho eventually wakes up, is given oxygen, and wakes up. Is he a changed man? Kentridge doesn't tell us. We must put ourselves in the position of Soho Eckstein and decide. The film of Soho Eckstein, that History of the Main, what a wonderful film, isn't it? I mean, it just blows me away. But the time that was finished was about the time that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had its first hearings. And although it's been universally admired and imitated, it has as its core a central paradox, of course. The paradox being that the more you confess about the terrible things you did, the more likely you were to escape scot-free. And that put Kentridge to mind of this 19th century play by Alfred Jarry, Ubu Roi. And in Ubu Roi, we have, it's an absurdist play in which a clownish brute of a king, there he is on that poster on the front cover of the program there, we see Ubu Roi as a clown there who does terrible brutish things. Ubu the king waltzes through life without paying any consequences for his act. And that somehow resonated with the times in which Kentridge was living. He then does a play which was performed in Johannesburg, which he called Ubu Tells the Truth, and then turns it into a stop-action movie that we've just seen, and that sort of thing. And at the opening scene of that movie, you see a police helicopter whirling above, searchlights, looking down, seeing what's going on. And then in Kentridge's inimitable way, that helicopter morphs into an all-seeing human eye. We can see at the left there. And then Ubu appears, the clown, with his magic wand, and he captures the eye. And he puts it on his head, and then he morphs into a camera, not only seeing, but recording everything. But he does nothing. The film then goes on, and we see Kentridge himself appearing, I think for the first time in one of these movies. And there he is, there's sort of microphones and bicycles and all the paraphernalia of city life. And there he is, taking off his clothes. Can you see in the top left-hand corner there? And then he stands under a shower, and he washes his hair, and there's a bucket there. And then he takes a birch stick, and he beats himself and gets all the scales off his back. And then does his front. And then, now he's thoroughly cleansed, he gets on a bicycle with his alter ego and pedals off into the sunset as if it never happened. Kentridge said himself that what troubles him is the fickleness of human nature and the fickleness of human memory. The question of how passions can be so fleeting and memory so short-lived gnaws at me constantly, as it gnaws at us today. Thank you.